If heaven is our country, what else is earth but an exile and banishment? If departure from this world is entry into life, what else is this world but a grave? What is it to remain here except to be plunged into death? An edifying reading from a book by John Calvin, 16th century French reformer. I talked to you about Martin Luther last Sunday, the German monk who sparked the Protestant Reformation that transformed the church and transformed Europe and really transformed the history of Western civilization. Luther was famous for his cheerfulness. There's a whole book of his table talk, which are like humorous and often bawdy sayings that he would say around the table while they were drinking beer and having dinner together. And he must have had fawning admirers who were there writing down the words that fell from his mouth. But always, even when he was facing extreme hardship, Luther was notorious for how happy and free-spirited he was. Well, I've just given you a little sample of John Calvin, a younger contemporary of Luther's who lived through the first half of the 1500s. And Calvin is almost notoriously miserable and pessimistic. I'll just give you an example. Think of a really nice sentimental Bible story, one of the ones children really love. I know which is the favorite. If you go into a bookshop and look at children's Bibles, you can see which is the best loved children's Bible story. Noah's Ark. You get the rainbow, you get all the animals 2 by 2, you get to go sailing and everything. Calvin, when he discusses this passage, he says, well, sure, Noah got spared, but it would have been better for him to die 100 times over than to end up in that floating tomb on the sea. And Calvin says, can you imagine anything more unbearable than the stench of all those animals and walking through the filth of their dung? That's Calvin's meditation on that Bible story that sounds so nice to our ears. Calvin was not an optimistic person. He had a deep pessimism about the human heart. In Calvin's view, and you might know the word Calvinism, which is often used as a way of describing a fairly pessimistic assessment of human nature. I'll give you a couple of examples of Calvin's pessimism. Calvin did not believe that human beings possess such a thing as free will. We all like to think that we have free will, don't we? Hands up if you have free will. Yeah, we all like the fact that we have free will. Well, Calvin said, technically we have free will. Our nature is designed in such a way that we're able to make choices. But he said, the real choice that we were created for was to say yes to God. Human beings were designed to enjoy union with God, to be in friendship and fellowship with God. So that's what we're created for. We are purpose-built for knowing God and enjoying God, right? When human beings turned away from God, what we've actually done is turned away from our own true nature. When I'm enjoying God, I am fully and truly myself. But when I turn away from God, I become less of myself. Something happens to me. My own nature, what I'm designed for begins to fade, begins to diminish, begins to go into disrepair. It's like if you have, trying to think of an example of this. If you have a blender in your kitchen and you start, I can't even think of anything. What's an inappropriate thing you could use a blender for? I don't know. You start using it for the wrong purpose, maybe to, I literally can't, to iron your clothes, thank you. If you keep using it to iron the clothes, over time, by misusing that thing, it's going to start to malfunction. That was a terrible example. Please, if anyone can think of a better one, tell me. Where you use a device in the wrong way. That was a really terrible example. If you use it to chop your wood, to shred wood, use your blender to shred wood. Thank you so much. You rescued. If you use your all right, you're getting the picture now. Using your iPhone to clean the bottom of the fish tank, something like that. If you use a thing incorrectly, it can damage its nature, and eventually it won't even be able to do the thing it was designed for. And Calvin thought that is what has happened to human nature. We're designed to enjoy God. We're designed to be in union with God. But when we turned away, we began to malfunction. We've diminished ourselves. So what happens when God reaches out to us through the gospel of Jesus and God calls us to respond? God calls us to faith. God gives us a new opportunity to repair our lives by coming back into union with God. What happens when we're given that choice? Do we freely say yes and respond? Calvin thought, not just thought, he believed with all his heart that it's impossible. When God reaches out to you and offers you the gift of life, your nature has become so diminished, it is malfunctioning so drastically that the only choice you'll make will be to turn away from God. When you're given the choice to turn to God, Calvin thought we will always say no. We will always turn the wrong way. So technically we have a free will, but in Calvin's view it's become diseased. I don't know if you've ever had an addiction to something. I'm sure many of us had. If you think of addiction, you still have a free choice. If there's a person who cannot stop drinking whiskey all day long, let's say, every time they reach for the bottle, they're using their will, right? They're making a choice. No one's ramming the glass of whiskey down their throat. It's being chosen freely. But if you give that person a choice one day, would you like to choose the whiskey or just have water today? The will has begun to malfunction. Technically they're free, but there's no freedom there. They just keep making the wrong choice until somehow, by some means, the will begins to be corrected. Well, that's a bit like the way Calvin thought about the human heart. Although we're created for God, it is impossible for us any longer to turn to God. It's a pretty pessimistic assessment of our condition. There is, in later Calvinist jargon, they used the term total depravity. Theologians love these gloomy phrases to describe the human condition. Not meaning that every person is as bad as they could be. If I say you are totally depraved, it doesn't mean you are as wicked as it's possible for anyone to be, but total meaning there is a corruption that permeates your nature. There's no part of you left, body or soul, that has not somehow begun to malfunction as a result of turning away from God. The whole of your life, the total structure of your life has begun to be diminished and to malfunction because we've not been living in the way we were created to live. Total depravity, the theologians call it. So this is pessimistic, right? This is not good news about humanity. How? If it's impossible for me ever to say yes to the gospel, if it's impossible for me ever to say yes to God's offer of life, then how does anyone ever become a follower of Jesus? In Calvin's view, it is impossible for the human heart to become a follower of Jesus. So how does it ever happen? Do you know the answer? This is Calvin's most famous idea. I probably shouldn't talk about it here because it's very impolite to talk about it in a sermon, but it was the idea of predestination. And all he meant by that was, let's say you hear the message of Jesus and you respond with a glad heart. Your life turns around. You attach yourself to Jesus. You begin to live the life that you were made for, enjoying God, living in union with God. Calvin says that first turning of the will, that little moment when something inside you said, yes to the gospel. He said that was a miracle. That was like a resurrection from the dead. That wasn't you exercising your freedom. That was God healing your nature, reaching down and turning your heart so that you could now choose to respond to the gospel. And once this happens, that's all I'm going to say about predestination. You can forget I mentioned it, right? I'm not advocating this idea for you tonight. I'm not trying to, it's bound up with Calvin's pessimistic assessment of human nature. That the only way we can be saved is if God unilaterally comes and reaches down and takes hold of us. If God said, I'll meet you halfway, God will be waiting a very long time and we will never make that response. If God said, I'll go 95% of the way and you just do the other 5%, we still won't be able to do it. God has to do everything for our salvation. The whole of our salvation has to come completely from the mercy of God, the power of God, the sovereignty of God, in Calvin's view. I just said I wasn't going to say anything else about predestination, and I just talked about it some more. So you get the idea. Calvin is pessimistic about human nature, but he doesn't mean that, to him, that doesn't mean we're all just thrown on the garbage heap and there's no hope for us. He combines his pessimistic view of the human heart with an optimism about grace, that what's impossible for human beings is possible for God. That although the whole of my nature might be disordered, malfunctioning, in disarray, God is able to heal and repair and restore. You might think that somebody with such an unflattering view of human nature would never get anything done, right? Maybe you're forming a picture of Calvin sort of sitting on the couch, watching TV, popping Prozac, eating donuts, and just feeling unhappy all the time about human nature. Well, in fact, he is probably the most successful social reformer who has ever lived in the history of the world. If you can think of someone else, let me know. I can't think of anyone else whose efforts at social reform have been so far-reaching and so profound. Calvin's pessimistic view of the human heart didn't lead to inactivity. It was actually linked to one of the most extraordinary social reforms in world history. Calvin, our modern ideas of democracy, the division of powers why do we have division of powers in democracy? It's because democracies are based on the assumption that the human heart should not be trusted. If you give all the power to someone, even if they're a really good person, their heart is still crooked inside, and anything's possible. So you divide the power to protect people from the corruption of the human heart. That comes from Calvin, who wrote a lot about politics and the division of powers. Ideas about revolution also stem back to Calvin, who said that he had a strong respect for law and order, right? Because if you don't have law and order, people are going to start hurting each other. He didn't assume, some people say, well, if you took away the police and the laws, we could all just get along as brothers and sisters. In Calvin's view, if you take away the law and order, we will become animals and start to destroy one another. So he had a strong respect for the law. But if you have a ruler who steps, and any ruler is under God's authority. Any ruler is ultimately answerable to God. And if they step out from under God's law, if they start, let's say, persecuting Christians and making it illegal for Christians to gather, then Calvin says that person is no longer, they actually cease to be a ruler when they do that, and they can be overthrown. So there's ideas there about the limits of political power. Everyone, kings, emperors, lawmakers, everyone is ultimately answerable to a higher authority, to God. Calvin's ideas about education transformed Europe. When he went to Geneva, he was from France, and he went to Geneva to become pastor of a community of refugees who had fled from persecution to seek refuge in Geneva, and Calvin went there to be their pastor. And one of the first things he did was set up a school so that all children, boys and girls, could receive an education, and the children of the poor would be able to receive education funded by the city. So it was like the idea of publicly funded education, public schools, was an idea of Calvin's that he implemented and had far-reaching effects. The list could go on and on. Calvin has been seen as the founder of modern commerce and capitalism, a famous book on this by the sociologist Max Weber, who said that capitalism comes from this huge... the way Calvin's thought gave rise to this huge work ethic, huge dedication to working. Anyway, so these are some examples of Calvin's far-reaching social influence. Here's the question I want to try and figure out tonight, right? How does this pessimistic view of the human heart lead to such an optimistic view about what's possible in the world? Calvin has a huge optimism about changing the world, creating new institutions, changing the structures of society, if necessary, overturning governments. An enormous optimism about the capacity of human beings to change the world, and a profound pessimism about the wickedness and brokenness and feebleness of the human heart. How do these things go together? I don't know what you think about. Do you understand the puzzle? I'm literally puzzled about this, but I'm going to try and give you one part of the explanation for how this works. Calvin is not just pessimistic about the human heart. Don't forget, he has a huge confidence in the sovereignty of God, in the mercy of God, in the fact that things that for us are impossible are possible for God. And when Calvin looks at the human heart, he doesn't see it in isolation. He doesn't loathe human beings or anything like that. He sees the human heart against this huge backdrop of the divine mercy. I'll read you another little snippet from this book of Calvin's, The Institutes. This is where he starts to go into raptures describing the work of God. He says, compared with God's brightness, the stars are obscured. By God's power, the mountains flow down like snow under the sun. By God's wrath, the earth is undermined. By God's wisdom, the wise are convicted of their cleverness. God's purity is so great that by comparison with it, all things are contaminated. God's righteousness is so great that the angels cannot bear to look at it. When God's justice is roused, it penetrates to the greatest depths of the earth. Who will dare approach God without trembling? And he goes on. This is someone, you see what I mean? He's not just a psychologist who is intrigued by the foibles of human nature. Calvin has drunk deep from the biblical prophets, from Isaiah, who sees a vision of God's sovereignty over the nations, of God's sovereignty over the whole course of history, of the way even human wickedness can be secretly directed by God to achieve good ends. Because of this vision of a sovereign, wise, just, fiercely righteous, infinitely loving, gracious, and merciful God, because of this, when Calvin looks at the human heart, it doesn't disempower him, it gives him a confidence to expect that anything could happen in this world. It also leads, like Luther, it leads Calvin to become amazingly fearless in the face of opposition. When kings and emperors and armies are rising up against him and against Calvin's community, he has a strange fearlessness. He'll even, he dedicates this book actually to the King of France. When he wrote the Institutes, it was dedicated to the King of France, who at the time was imprisoning and putting Protestant Christians to death and giving them a really hard time. And Calvin dedicates it and says, look, Your Majesty, I just want you to know, we're decent people. This is what we actually believe. We're not eating babies or anything crazy. We're good, law-abiding people. So he appeals to the king and then adds a threat. If you step out from under God's authority, if you trespass against God's law, there's a whole section in the book that basically is making veiled threats against political rulers. Calvin's strange fearlessness in the face of opposition comes from his belief that ultimately the affairs of this world are in the hands of God. That if God calls a person to do something, then anything that this world might rise up in opposition against you is nothing to be afraid of. Calvin appeals to a higher authority, to a higher law than the laws of nations. So I think this is part of the explanation anyway for how a deeply pessimistic view of the human heart can actually give rise, in Calvin's case, to a huge optimism about changing this world for the better. Now, do we want to change the world today? Do we believe today that it's possible anymore to change the world? I think there are three things that we could learn from Calvin and from that spirit of Christian protest, that Protestant spirit that sort of burned through everything he did. First, maybe we've got a naive optimism about how we could quite easily change the world and make it match our expectations. Maybe we've got a naive optimism. The world's not perfect, but it could be. If we dissolve the existing structures and come up with a better idea, we could easily make this world a better place. We could get rid of poverty in 3 or 4 quick steps. Maybe we've got a naive optimism that it would be quite easy to alter reality. If that's the case, then I think something to learn from Calvin is, well, let me put it another way. The problem with that kind of naive optimism, it's good, it gives rise to energy. People go out and start doing things, right? The problem with it, it inevitably leads to disillusionment. Why? Because when you go out just expecting that the world will bend to your wishes, when you go out with a vision of a better world, expecting that people will just naturally get on board as soon as they hear your ideas, the only problem with that, the best vision in the world will run up against one obstacle, and that is the wretched human heart. The human heart it doesn't always respond to goodness. Look at the good people in history. Look at the best people in history. Socrates, they sentence him to death. Jesus, he gets himself crucified. Martin Luther King Jr. It doesn't end well in this world for the righteous person because they come up against the obstacle of the human heart. So if you've got that naive optimism about changing the world, then I think one thing to take away from Calvin and from the Protestant vision of human nature is a more realistic assessment of the challenges that any attempt to change this world for the better will face. And that challenge is not primarily social structures or institutions or ideologies. The big obstacle is the human heart itself, which gives rise to social structures and institutions and ideologies. They are not the root cause of the problems in this world. It's the human heart that gives rise to these things. So that's one thing we could take away from Calvin if we are naive optimists. What happens when you start out as a naive optimist, then you get disillusioned? Sometimes the next step is become a wise, middle-aged people are terrible for this, become a middle-aged cynic. The person for whom nothing is any longer possible in this world. The person who sees through all youthful optimism and sees that in this world things will always go on the way they always do. If we've become cynics who no longer expect anything, who no longer believe we can make any positive change in this world, then I think there's something to learn from Calvin's idea as well. The cynic has taken away one half of Calvin's vision. The pessimism about the human heart. What's the cynic missing? The optimism of grace. The vision not of the human heart just throbbing away in lonely isolation, but the human heart against a huge backdrop of the divine majesty, the divine grace, the divine goodness, the divine sovereignty that is able to turn any heart towards God and towards the good of this world. If we become cynical in our view of this world, then I think Calvin's thought can be an encouragement to take up that Protestant vision, that because of the grace of God, anything in this world is possible. Because of the grace of God, there is no, when you come up against the obstacle of the human heart, that is not an invincible obstacle. Grace, the grace of the sovereign God, is the invincible power in this world. So there's the second thing I think we could take away from Calvin, if we are no longer optimistic but cynical. There's a third thing that I think creates problems for us today. Let's say that we've taken Calvin's pessimistic view of the human heart and his optimistic view of divine grace, and we've accepted, yes, we ought to make a contribution to this world. We ought to change this world for the better. This world, in some way, should be better than it was when we got here. If we take up that challenge, here's the problem for us today, and I think it's a special problem for us today. Which change am I going to strive for? We live in a society, partly the kind of hugely complex world we live in was Calvin's creation. It was partly the creation of Luther and Calvin to create a more complex, more multifaceted social world. There are many things in this world that are broken. If I feel in my heart the urge to make some difference, what am I going to do? Am I going to devote my life to education or to social development? Or am I going to try and going to be an activist? Am I going to go into politics? Or is changing the laws and making more just laws the way to go? So should I go into politics or should I go into law? Sometimes we can go through all the options and it can be like looking for, just looking for a loaf of bread in the supermarket, and you can end up walking out without any bread because there's too many choices, there's too many possibilities. If we feel really acutely the challenges of this world, do you know what I'm saying? What are we going to do? And sometimes people with a lot of goodwill to change the world end up going from one cause to the next. I'm going to sign every petition. I'm going to protest against everything. I'm going to be involved in everything. But if you spread yourself out really thin like that, you don't end up making any real difference. Here's, and this is the last thing I want to say. Here's where I think Calvin's thought is really relevant for us. Calvin had a strong emphasis, as did Luther before him, a strong emphasis on the individual's vocation. Previously, you might know, the only people who got a vocation were priests and monks. God would people were just sort of doing their thing, farming and getting educated and whatever, but God would call some people, give them a calling, a vocation to become a monk or to become a professional religious person. In Calvin's view, Every single human being has a vocation. For someone, Calvin esteemed people who do practical work with their hands, like carpentry and crafts. God can call a person to do that. He esteemed education. God can call a person just to study. I teach at the theological college. We're always having to tell the church, the reason we're doing all this study is because we think it will have an effect on the world in this way. It's not really true. They just like to hear that there's going to be a practical outcome. If someone is studying, often that's, given the whole thing. If someone's studying, in Calvin's view, that can be a divine calling, a vocation to learn. If someone is raising children, it doesn't have to be a means to another end. It can be a divine calling to do that. And in Calvin's view, when we treat any task, any work that happens to be, forget about what's the ideal plan for my life, what is it right now today that I have in front of me? What's the work that I can do today? What's the task before me today? Instead of just doing it to earn a few dollars or to pass my assignment at uni or whatever, instead of doing it like that, if I seize upon it as a divine opportunity, if I seize upon it as something that God has put into my life, into my hands today, then the work that I do, in a strange way, it both energizes me to put myself into that work, not just to do it with one half of my brain over here, but actually to bring myself to that work, and to believe that through this work, God's glory can be revealed. That through this work, something in the world can change in the direction of the kingdom of God, the justice, the righteousness of God. This was not a naive vision, it actually worked. People right across Europe in the 16th century took up this vision that their daily work was a work for God. That in their daily work they were answerable to God. And in small incremental ways, a new world was established, a new social order, very different from what had been there before. So here's the third and final thing that I'd like to suggest we can learn from Calvin's Protestant spirit. Not to try and change everything in the world, but perhaps to change myself, to change the way I see my work, and to see behind it a huge backdrop of the sovereign, majestic, gracious God who is Lord of the nations, Lord of the human heart, and Lord over my work today.